Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. We have reached the penultimate episode in our series on the history of bad ideas, and we welcome back the philosopher and writer Kathleen Stock. I'm going to be talking to her about the idea of the death of the author. It was once very fashionable. It is often sometimes appealing, and it can do a lot of harm. Kathleen explains why. There's a famous essay by Roland Barthes, which was published in 1967, called The Death of the Author. Can you remember where you first came across the idea? Was it the kind of French version, the Barthes version, the post-something version?
I think it wasn't the French version, although I was doing French at university. It was maybe even before that, but it was one of those books that it was really cool to have. I had that one. I had Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, is it? Oh, gosh. It's all gone out of my head now, but anyway, yes, so that one had a nice cool cover, and it seemed like from what I could gather, a kind of exciting, the sort of idea that if you're a nerdy 17-year-old, you like, which is that contrary to what you might have thought, the meaning of a text kind of exceeds what the author was trying to do, and it's up to the reader, in fact, or at least it's up to the universe. It's not, so the author hasn't got the control of meaning in the text that you might have thought that they did when you grew up reading lots of novels. So I became aware of it there just as a cool idea. And then as I became an academic, I became more and more annoyed, actually, by what seemed to be a blithe acceptance amongst my fellow philosophers that this was roughly right, and that when we were in particular dealing with fiction, I mean, of course, you can have a more extended thesis, which is about all texts, but the people I was hanging out with seemed to think that when you were dealing with fiction, you couldn't possibly be trying to interpret texts or novels, stories in terms of the author's intention. There was something incoherent about that, and they were all anti-intentionalist. So I thought, well, this is silly. I'm going to be an intentionalist. I'm going to argue that, of course, what you're doing is trying to recover the author's intention. So basically, I ended up writing a book about that. And I still think that's true, actually.
We'll come on in a second to why it's true. I'd never read Barthes, The Death of the Author, until a couple of days ago. It's very much of its time. So it feels, if I hadn't known, I would have said, I bet this was written in about 1968. It was actually written in 1967, because it's clearly angry about the celebration of a certain kind of French author, particularly novelist, sort of Balzac or whatever it is, and the veneration in French society at that time of certain kinds of voices. And he is trying to place himself on the side of the people. And this is some kind of democratic idea. And it's just before the student failed revolutions of 1968. And I can completely sort of see some of the appeal in that context. There's an establishment and an established view, and also some establishment individuals who dominate French letters and French fictions, and they end up in the pantheon. You know, there's that kind of hierarchy, and it's a very anti-hierarchical idea. But it also feels really dated. I mean, it feels like it comes from 1968.
Yeah, that's fascinating to put it in that context. And I think it also goes along with just a kind of anxiety, which I assume was kicking around like post-Watergate, post-Vietnam, or during Vietnam, you know, the sort of loss of trust and faith in institutions, and suddenly everything's getting a bit unstable and destabilized, and suddenly there's this cool new philosophical theory, post-structuralism, which says that meaning is constantly unstable and being deferred, and you're right that it has a kind of gloss of popular appeal because it makes you think, oh, I can get to the meaning of this text. You see, of course, it's going to turn out on my view that you always could, and that's completely compatible with intentionalism. But, you know, if you thought that, if you had this false idea that the meaning of a text was something locked up in it that only the author knew about, and you'd have to go into his head somehow to extract it, or only sort of elite interpreters and critics could get at, and you'd have to go to them. Suddenly, it's a bit like, I don't know, this is an overblown comparison, but it seems to be a bit like Protestantism arriving and saying you can read the Bible directly, you don't have to go via the priests, and you get to decide what it means. So yes, it must have seemed very seductive in that context. By the time I came across it, it was 1990 or something, like post-structuralism had completely gripped the French literature world in universities, people studying French literature, and it was all deconstruction this and deconstruction that, and it worked when you applied it to certain authors, Flaubert being the most obvious one. So there was this critic called Jonathan Culler who was taking a deconstructive attitude to Flaubert and pointing out that really Flaubert was doing something like proto-deconstruction, always trying to unstabilize your sense of where the narrator was and changing the name of a character within a scene, but for no apparent reason, and just kind of like messing with you basically. And that seemed to apply to certain texts, but it didn't seem to me to apply to all of them by any means.
And that also is not the death of the author, because Flaubert is doing that. So there have always been authors who've tried to destabilize the reader with unreliable narrators and all of that.
Completely compatible with intentionalism once you understand what intentionalism is in its best version. People were just basically tilting at windmills and arguing with terrible versions of intentionalism and then deciding that the whole thing must be false.
And certainly in the case of Barthes' essay, it's almost exclusively about fiction. So you could apply it more widely, and we'll talk about whether it can be applied more widely and the ways in which maybe these days almost everyone is at it, saying the author doesn't control the meaning of the text. But what is it about fiction that particularly, so not the Flaubert version, but the idea, I think it's Balzac that he starts with, but the idea that this authorial voice that claims to be authoritative is not, because the author is in some senses not in control of the voices and the material that is being channeled through him. And it's also very much about a him in this context. All of the people that he selects are hymns, men, male. What is it about the idea, particularly of the novel, that made it appealing to say, it might seem like Dickens or whoever it is in charge of this fictional world, but he's not?
Well, I think it looks appealing when you compare fiction to non-fiction, or at least here's one way in which it might be appealing, that with non-fiction, writing a non-fictional text, as in a kind of newspaper report or just a straightforward description of a real life event, it looks like we can understand that according to ordinary conversational rules. We can say, like, what's the author trying to do here? Well, they're trying to tell us something, and we understand that they're trying to tell us something true. They're trying to be relevant. They're trying to not to be obscure. They're not going to repeat themselves. There's certain rules of the game that we're all pretty familiar with, and you could just apply those. In fiction, it doesn't look like those rules apply. Like, people can be very obscure. Clearly, James Joyce was very obscure. People can repeat themselves. Again, James Joyce repeated himself. And you're not dealing with truth, crucially. If you are, it's in a kind of etiolated sense or a completely different sense to just describing what actually happened. You're inventing things most of the time. So it looks like the ordinary rules of interpreting what someone meant and what they intended to do or say or communicate can't be used. And at that point, you could become skeptical that there are any rules, really. I'm not. But that would be the way you would make a difference and say, well, novels, they're not about an author, a person telling you something that happened to them. They're about inventing a world. And then the other aspect I suppose you might bring in is that there's a very low cost to getting it wrong. So there's a much higher cost in nonfiction for the author getting it wrong and for the reader who misunderstands it, depending on what they're going to do. But, if you read about a war that's going on and the journalist just made it up, then that seems to have much bigger consequences than if you read about a novel about a war and the person just made it up. Clearly, that has no bad consequences. So it seems like easier to say that readers have this input into the meaning of fictions because they're not truth directed. It doesn't look like it has any real world consequences either way. And it also looks like fun and creative and gives the reader something to do, doesn't present them as passive. All of this is, I'm giving the case for the opposition here. I think this is all nonsense, but...
And one of the odd things about it is that the world of fiction, where there aren't any rules, would seem to give the author more power and more authority than the world where authors are constrained by some of the conventions. So I'm partly thinking of, there's another classic text from about a decade earlier, Susan Sontag Against Interpretation, making an argument against the endless search for the meaning behind the text, but saying in place of that, what we should do is focus on the form, because the form actually sets the limits of this. And this is in art as well as in, pieces of more factual writing. The form is the constraint. If, in the case of fiction, the idea is this is relatively formless, what it seems to do, rather than empower the reader, is empower the author. I mean, I'm inching towards the argument against here.
First of all, it's not true that there aren't rules. There's language for a start, and language is profoundly rule-based. So actually, these positions like Sontag's, which talk about art, but I can't remember, to be honest, but, let's just assume she didn't make a distinction between visual art and novels. You need to make a distinction there, because if there are rules of understanding for photographs and paintings, they're not the same as understanding a novel. But so clearly what documentary texts and fictional texts have in common is that they use language, and we know, so we can understand words, and we can understand sentences, and we can understand paragraphs, and all the time we read, we're kind of, it's like a hermeneutic circle of working out what the paragraph means by working out what the words mean, and working out what the words mean by working out what the paragraph means, and we're looking at the context, where we think this is going, what we think the author was trying to do, and so on. But it's true that moving past the sort of semantic and syntactic basics of the words, in fiction, you've got a different set of objectives to documentary texts and documentary writing. You've got, and this will depend on the author, but you've got, you want to write a comedy, you want to make people laugh, or you want to make them cry, or you want to make some kind of hugely intelligent, complicated metafiction in order to explore the nature of fiction, or you want to bring up something from your past in order to do a kind of fictional meditation on it, or you just want to sell loads of copies, write romance, write erotica. There's just a range of things you could be doing with fiction. And once we know or roughly guess what the purpose is, what the genre is, what the author was trying to do, we can start feeding that into our understanding of what this sentence means and what this paragraph means. And that can change as we go through reading the text. As you've said, there are unreliable narrators that can change our conception of what was being done right at the end. But none of that is random. And we're not just looking at tea leaves or making pictures out of clouds in the sky. This is an intelligible, goal-driven human activity that we are reconstructing. Like, what is he or she trying to tell us or show us or make us imagine? That's my view.
That is your case.
That's my view, yeah.
So if you read a novel, and in the way I guess Barthes would want you to read it, which is to say, here are these words, they mean things depending on the different ways in which you read them, and it's kind of up to you where you go with this. What is it misunderstanding about the book?
Well, I don't think you can read a fiction like that profitably, let's just say. I mean, you could do that with some words. That sounds a bit like free association. You just think, well, what does that remind me of? What does that put me in mind of?
What does it make me feel?
Exactly. What do you see when you hear this? But, what's the point in that? You might as well do that for any text. Why this text and not the back of a cornflakes packet? That's a sort of caricatural response. But I do think it's true. Like, what makes this a text that's worth exploring? So I don't think people do approach texts like that. I think they're always treating texts as purposive, rather, objects that have been produced by humans, not machines or random collections of letters just thrown together by the wind. You think a mind made this, and I want to know what that mind was trying to do. And you can be unsure. The meaning can be locked away and obscure. You can't understand it. All of that's possible. You can be wrong. But that's all completely compatible with the idea that the meaning is what the author intended. Even if you can't get it, even if he was very bad at showing you, I think that's what you're always trying to do. And I think all the arguments that people come up with against intentionalism are just really bad. Like they say things like, but you can't get inside someone's head just to see what they really meant. Of course you can't, because that's not what understanding intentional action is. I've just picked up a coffee cup. You didn't have to get inside my head to know that I was trying to get it to my lips and drink. You had a kind of framework to understand my action and like the possible goals I might have in doing that. And it's just like that. Communication is just like that, except that the goals are different and the ways in which we understand the actions are different. But speech is an action, whether it's in the context of fiction or nonfiction. And we need to sort of get at what the person was trying to do with that set of words.
Part of the kind of 1960s version of the critique would be, okay, authors intend something with their text, but authors misunderstand their own agency here because, so this would be the more Marxist version, this is a bourgeois novel, and this author thinks they're in control of what it is that they're trying to express, but actually this is a typical product of a certain kind of social or cultural worldview, mind view, and therefore prioritizing the intention of the author, this would be the Marxist version, prioritizing the intention of the author downplays the extent to which the author is a kind of generic version of a social or cultural setting. Okay.
Well, both of those things can be true for a start. I mean, because our minds, if you take as the starting point that this is a product of a mind, minds have intentional, conscious aspects and they have unconscious aspects. I mean, I believe in the psychoanalysis. I believe in the unconscious mind. Of course, so take it away from text. Just kind of like if you're talking to someone and they're talking in a really angry tone of voice and you say, why are you so angry? And they say, I'm not angry. And they don't know that they're angry, but you can see through the way that they are expressing themselves that they're angry. Well, text can have those properties. They can express things that the author did not know they were expressing. And that can, of course, include sociopolitical position, class aspects that, they've got no idea about, that you can read into the text by the things they talk about and how they say them. That's all fine because it would be a stupid version of intentionalism said that the author was in control of everything. The author is in control of the characters, the plot events, some of the metaphorical aspects, there's some of the symbolism, like, does this red room in Jane Eyre mean, is it symbolizing a womb, or is it symbolizing something else? They can be in control of those elements. And then there can be other things that they don't even know are there, that they don't see, and stuff that the reader just thinks, that reminds me of this and that, it's purely personal. So not really public objects to be discovered anyway. I think you can admit all of that. Now, the final thing you said when you were describing this Marxist view is that we shouldn't pay attention to the intention because it's much more interesting to focus on the kind of generic collective aspects, but I disagree with that. I find individual minds very interesting, and I find collective mental properties very boring. So that's not for me.
Not for me. I'm trying to put the other side.
Yeah,
so another version of it might be, and when I read Barthes, I think I got the appeal of this argument, and I can imagine different contexts in which it's appealing, because it's partly about, it's a rejection of a certain kind of authorial authority, and it can be quite irksome. Reading a book can be quite an irksome experience because there's this sort of godlike voice. People sometimes find, reading Middlemarch, that that's
the narrator. That's not the author. I mean, those two different things, right?
But the experience of reading something like Middlemarch, you get this sense that George Eliot has arranged a universe in a godlike way and is moving the characters around.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an incredibly rare gift. But I can understand a human response which feels that there is something manipulative about this. So there's a version of intentionality, which is the thought that the author intends to create an effect in the reader. So the author wants to tell a story in a way that produces certain kinds of emotional responses. And to kill the author is one way of trying to resist that feeling that it's a very sort of unbalanced relationship, that the author gets to call the shots and the reader...
It's very juvenile, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm trying to make the case.
It's making me laugh because I'm just imagining these poor characters, I'm sure it's been done like in a modernist way, but these poor characters being pushed around by these godlike authors, like, oh God, not again. Do I really have to go to Birmingham or whatever? I just think that's what fiction is, I mean, also I think that there's two different perspectives you can take on the content of a fiction. You can see it as the product of George Eliot. You can kind of painstakingly trace her decisions, or try to, about why she included this character at this point, for what reason. Or you can forget about all of that and you can enter into an imaginative attitude towards it where you are immersed. You no longer treat these as fictional characters that are the product of Eliot's pen. You think of them as fully rounded human beings living in a market town somewhere near Birmingham, and you engage with them that way. Now, that's the way in which most people engage with fiction. They don't care who wrote it, why they wrote it, past the sort of, they need to know what kind of novel they're dealing with roughly to understand what kind of thing it is, but they're not interested in the like fine-grained decision-making that went behind it, or what kind of cultural context was there. So we have this capacity to immerse ourselves in fiction, and while we're doing it, we don't treat it as a fiction. Like, it would destroy the imaginative immersion if we thought, somebody wrote this, somebody made this up in their bedroom. We want to think of them as utterly not made up, as real people that were born and died just like we do. So I think that that's another aspect, that sometimes people notice that that's the attitude most people take to fiction. And then because it's not deliberately interpretive and particularly reflective and difficult, they think, well, they can't be pursuing the author's intentions, because that sounds like something complicated, and most people don't have complicated relations to fictions.
So what were the arguments that philosophers made back to you when you said, this is clearly, so these are the words you just used to me. It's juvenile. It's kind of ridiculous.
Well, that's because they wouldn't put it like that. I mean, you've made it sound, I think rightly, like a bit of a teenage rebellion against dad or something,
It's 1968.
No, it completely makes sense. But analytic philosophers don't care about historical context, for a start. They don't care about what else was happening in the world when this came up. They want to know whether it's true or not. That's all they want to know. So the arguments that would come up against me were, I mean, that one I mentioned about you can't get inside people's heads, that's a pretty terrible objection, but it was made to me. Another one is this misunderstanding, I think, but the idea would be, if you're looking for the author's intentions, somehow that takes you away from the text. It perniciously decentralizes the thing you're interested in, because you're no longer interested in this novel. You're interested in George Eliot's thoughts about this novel. And surely when we're engaged with art, we should be engaged with the objects and not the author's minds. But I think that's a false position, as you might anticipate. You can't really understand what the object is unless you understand what the mind is. But of course, you're not interested in irrelevant aspects of the mind. I mean, I have no interest in most aspects of authors' minds. I don't read interviews with them for fun. You read interviews because you want to understand, like, you read an interview with Cormac McCarthy because you want to understand more about Blood Meridian. That's the only interest I'd have. But it's not, you can't separate out the mind from the thing that they made, in the same way as you can't really separate out my mind from the things I'm saying. Like, the things I'm saying, in order to understand them, you have to understand a little bit about my mind, I think.
When you were having these arguments in, the early 2000s? Mid-2000s?
Yeah, I probably started then. I wrote a whole book about it. I defended various bits of it. It was a long, yeah.
But, so on the one hand, it was a long time ago. On the other hand, this is it's not quite the sort of AI age, but it's the computer age. And this is the age of computer-generated text, which we are now in. Even more so, There are now machines that can write quite plausible mimicry, and presumably completely unintentional. There is no intentionality.
Let's assume that.
In the absence of consciousness, there's no intentionality there. So the kind of philosophers that were arguing with you,
that's what they would say.
This would be right. So they would say, look, this can be done by an unintending word-generating machine before ChatGPT.
I mean, yes, of course. You could get computers to generate texts that you could then read with the attitude that you were trying to work out what kind of mind produced this. So with the AI case, there's two different scenarios. One is where you know that it was produced by an AI, and one is where you don't. Now, if you don't, then I think there's just nothing interesting about that. You just treat it as if it was the product of a mind. It is not, in fact, the product of mind, let's say, because we're assuming for the sake of argument, computers don't have minds. So you got it wrong in the same way that you might look at a fake painting and think it was a Rembrandt, or you might look at a computer-generated portrait and think it's by a person. No problem there. The question is what you do when you do know that it's computer-generated. And here I think there's nothing else to do but act as if it had a mind. It was a product of a mind. That's the only thing you can do. I don't see why that shows that there's any problem for the cases where it genuinely is a product of the mind. It just means that you're acting as if it had one, and you're applying all the skills that you normally would apply. And sometimes they'll work and produce simulacra of meaning. And sometimes they won't, because the text won't facilitate that. I imagine after it'd be an interesting experience. And from the perspective of someone who just wants to get immersed in a fiction, it might be perfectly satisfying. But I think in terms of producing something that seems like satisfying, like a great work of art is satisfying, ultimately, I feel like you would start to find it a bit soulless.
My experience of trying to read, you can tell ChatGPT or whatever the latest version is to write a poem in the style of Philip Larkin, and it will produce a really convincing sort of, not even a pastiche, but a convincing Philip Larkin poem. And you read it and you think, well, this is a convincing Philip Larkin poem. I can't imagine wanting to read it again and try and think about what this poem means, because the second I know it's been produced by a non-thinking machine, I'm just not interested. And that must be part of the case.
Well, that helps my view. I mean, that really does.
I am on your side.
The trouble is you're also going to meet people who say, and they mean it, that they would be just as interested in
talking. They don't mean it.
No, they do.
Do
but that's
they?
Because they don't understand what's good about Philip Larkin, I mean, the trouble is we don't all do the same thing with texts. So to some extent, I suppose my argument is kind of like, this is what you do if you want to get the most out of something. Of course you could say, oh, it's really about my mother, or, it's about the Second World War when it seems to be about Troy. But I think for those claims to stick, and then for those, that's kind of a meta framework, but it will then allow you to find new details and reliably find new details. And that the author would have had to have something to do with that, I think.
Another thing that stands out about the Barthes essay is that it's trying to take down the author. So the authors, these sort of authoritative figures with their statues and this and that, are being brought down. And at the same time, it's trying to valorize the reader. So it's all about empowering the reader. And it has quite a, I think, idealized view of the reader, including the sort of democratic reader. The idea that people are going to be reading Balzac and they're going to be having a sort of rich response to this. And so as the author comes down, the reader goes up. So I found myself thinking this morning, I happened to go down a wormhole online, which was a series of articles that have been written by humanities teachers and academics in America, saying that no one that we teach reads anymore. So reading has sort of stopped, in that we used to set whole books, but that's too hard. And so we reduced it to 30-page extracts, but people won't read 30 pages anymore. And the people who are writing these things were writing it we get it. We also look at our phone every 10 seconds. We find it really hard to focus on an extended, the idea of reading a Balzac novel, so the reader is being empowered. So if we're living in the age where people are reading little snippets of books, right? The empowering of the reader is actually an empowering of people who have no interest in the whole thing, but they want to pull out the bit. I thought Barthes' version was this sort of idealized version of democratic readership, where it's like a collective, serious endeavor. The intellectuals are in the streets now. No one believes that. We're living in an age, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone, where it's actually quite hard to take on board a whole text. I'm doing a series for this podcast about great political fictions, and I went into a bookshop yesterday to buy some of these books, and I felt my heart sink because I'd forgotten that Phineas Finn is 700 pages long, and I'm going to be reading Atlas Shrugged, and I just feel I can't do it. It's too much. This is a long-winded way of saying I think it's asking too much of the readers.
Is. I mean, but then again, is it? Because the point is, what would ascertain that the reader got it right on this view? So that's another thing that it does badly, is that it makes all interpretations equal ultimately? Like what you'd, or at least subject to like subjective feelings of satisfaction or something. Like there's no external standard anymore to say that this person read this book right and this didn't. Now, at this point, a lot of people, from my experience, will be going, there's no right way to read Middlemarch. But I think actually there's a lot of wrong ways to read Middlemarch. A book as rich as Middlemarch certainly doesn't have one theme or even one canonical interpretation. I'm not saying that like you pull out the meaning and then that just forecloses discussion, because of course there's always more to find, and an author as brilliant as Eliot is capable of having like 3 different purposes in this towards the same work, because actions can be multi-purposive.
But 3 purposes is not no purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the point.
Exactly. And we can argue about what they are. All of that is still available. All of that rich engagement is available. But if you're somebody who thinks that the author's got nothing to do with it, then how can we say, well, this interpretation is just really reductive and stupid and has completely misunderstood the aim of the author or other things they've said in interviews, or look, compare this work and this work. How could this be true of an author that wrote this book? So intentionalism allows us to take bits from the author's life, from their wider oeuvre, their formative experiences, their diaries, their manuscripts, anything. You can just like magpie, like pull it all in and use it to understand more about what someone was doing. And there are new discoveries all the time. We find out Virginia Woolf had just read this book when she wrote this, and we see that she was getting this theme through. Or you find out about someone's sexuality and suddenly it changes the way you understand what they wrote. So,
and in the same way that when you discover that it was written by an AI, in my experience, I've lost interest. There is nothing more exciting than the only version of this experience I've ever had is, do you know that short story by E.M. Forster, The Machine Stops?
No.
So there's a short story by E.M. Forster called The Machine Stops, which people are always citing as he like predicted the internet, because it's like a world in which we all live in little pods and we kind of connect through these sort of tubes, and we've sort of alienated ourselves from real human experiences, sort of things we were talking about in relation to Facebook friends. And the other person, weirdly, who wrote something very similar, so he's a very unlikely person to have invented the internet. You don't think of Ian Forster. But the more unlikely person is Gandhi. And Gandhi in Hind Swaraj, written in 1909, has a similar passage where he says, there is a future coming where we will press a button and a car will appear at our house without a driver, and we'll press another button and we'll get newspapers without having to buy them, and food will be delivered to us. And then I worked out that he wrote it 6 weeks after Ian Forster wrote it on a ship which would have had a copy of Ian Forster's thing. And I remember thinking, this is the most exciting, because clearly that is right. I mean, how else would Gandhi have kind of, and that's...
Are you saying he plagiarized him?
No, I'm just saying that that's where the idea came from. And there is something, it's not a trivial example, because actually it's quite interesting. These are 2 important texts, but it's because he was on a ship, and I'm sure in the ship's library there was a copy. I think he published the story in something like the Oxford and Cambridge Gazette or something. But you realize that the source of this is one human being writing something that shaped the thoughts of another human being. And there's no other way of explaining it.
Maybe not. So that sort of example can happen unconsciously or consciously. And yes, texts are not just interesting for the intentions, and they can also be things you find out, like we just said, about a text that the author was not aware of even, or that they didn't want to disclose. But one example I like, and it's more about what seems like an authorial mistake in a text can then be transformed when you understand what they were trying to do. So it's in one of those books by John Sutherland, those really nice little books about sort of fictional puzzles. It's about Emma. There's a passage in Emma by Jane Austen where somebody's standing on a hilltop with a vista in front of them and talking about what seems to be talking about, I think it's apple blossom in June or something like that. So for a while, people thought that this was a mistake because apple doesn't blossom in June. But then if you reread this passage, it's actually like a little montage, and it's not a literal description of what the character sees. It's actually a kind of montage of what you might see at different seasons while standing here. So there's apple blossom, and then there's other, I don't know, foliage-related seasonal events that I've forgotten. And then you think, well, that's what she was trying to do, and that makes complete sense. But you wouldn't, with an AI, there'd be no discussion about that, because it's not that they made a mistake or that they were trying to do something clever. There's just the words, basically.
Have you ever written fiction?
Yes, I have. Not for a long time. I do have, most people have a ambition to write a novel. I'm one of them.
So in the writing that you have done, so you've done quite technical, analytical philosophy, where there's a high premium on a certain kind of formal, I guess, is accuracy the word? Or
just technicality.
Sort of technical precision.
Yeah. You are supposed to, there's a lot of like numbered premises and let U stand for utterance and let P be the content of utterance U and, stuff like that.
Yeah. The tick that I always found most annoying about analytical philosophy is paragraphs that begin with the word notice. You know what I'm talking about there.
There's so much that's annoying about that style of writing.
So you've also written other kinds of writing. So now you write journalism, and in between, you've written a book that's become a well-known and, in its way, somewhat notorious book. And part of the notoriety is because people have, I think it's fair to say, misread it.
Actually, I think you're being charitable to think that these people have actually read it at all. But yeah,
Well, you've experienced people telling you that what your book says is not what you think it says.
Yes, and if they haven't read that, which most of my critics have not read my book because they wouldn't want to touch it with a barge pole, but certainly they've caught snippets of other stuff and decided that I must have meant something that I didn't. Yes, that is a very familiar experience.
So having, on the one hand, for philosophical academic reasons, wanted to defend intentionality, and then
I've got professional reasons.
You've got personal reasons
yes.
to feel that the death of an author can do bad things to the author. Do they connect, or do you think of these things as separate? Do you think you haven't stumbled into a nightmarish version of Roland Barthes' Death of the Author? You've stumbled into a nightmarish version of what we talked about in the other episode, which is kind of the madness of the 21st century.
Both. But I do think there's a sort of indirect connection potentially, because what was always a bit unclear about these Death of the Author claims, anti-intentionalist claims, was whether they were saying this is what happens or it's what should happen. Like, were they saying you actually already don't try to understand what the author is saying, just leave everything as it is, I'm analysing what you do? Or is it a prescriptive, you're there beavering away trying to work out what the author says, stop that immediately and do something different, this is what you should be doing? And I think that was always unclear. But I think what effectively this sort of academic phase, which, let's face it, hundreds of thousands of students have been exposed to ideas about post-structuralism and destabilization of meaning. I'm pretty sure it's meant that quite a lot of them think, well, I don't have to try very hard to understand what this person means because, that's kind of incoherent anyway. And so it's quite conceivable to me that we've become lazier as a result and more satisfied with our own first interpretations of people and their texts. It sort of gives you permission almost to be broad brush or lazy, or just to see it, as I say, like treat it like tea leaves. Well, I think that you're clearly a transphobic bigot in writing this, so you must be, because I say so.
And because you don't have authority over your own book.
Well, yeah, I guess. Although, you see, the thing is that...
But they also want to blame you for the book.
Yeah, it's an unstable position, because if it really was nothing to do with me...
Then why are they so cross?
Why are they so angry with me? Yeah, exactly. They actually... What we haven't lost is the responsibility that authors are still given, moral responsibility. In fact, as you know, like our world has become saturated with moralization about authors in particular, like the things they... Right, that it's almost like we've lost the ability to distinguish in some cases between the author and the characters they produce or the arguments that they produce. And authors are always being blamed for the things their characters do these days. So it's almost like simultaneously, whilst people have taken on board superficially the idea that the author isn't that authoritative, we still want to punish them.
You know that John Ronson book, So You've Been
Yes.
Publicly Shamed? So it begins with an example. So I was saying maybe part of the problem here is people don't read whole books, but it begins with the famous case of a woman who tweeted as she got onto a plane to South Africa, and it was a joke. It wasn't a great joke. It was a joke which it wasn't racist, but if you didn't notice it was a joke, it looked racist. And she arrived in South Africa after a 10-hour flight, the most hated woman in the world. And then her line was, but it was a joke and it's too late, because by that point, the world has decided that what she intended by this tweet is no longer relevant. And what I found most interesting about that was John Ronson, his interest in the case was that he said he made a similar joke, not a racist joke, but a joke with a similar structure. It's kind of like, this is only funny if you read it literally and then noticed it can't be meant literally. And he saw his career flashing before his eyes. I think he said he made it in the context of an article where there was at least context, and the danger with a one-off Twitter joke by an anonymous person, no one knows who they are, is the words just, but that he got a glimpse of a possible future of his own where he was her. And that's not because people aren't reading whole books. That's because these little snippets of communication just exist in the world to be deconstructed.
And Twitter is the worst for that, actually, because it's not just that you've got a very short character limit, so you can basically give practically no context for your burning thought. And also that people don't really know, most people who read it won't know you. So quite often in face-to-face conversation, and even with reading a novel, we have some picture of the kind of person that produced it. But with social media, public social media, you've got no idea. But then it gets retweeted, which means it just becomes even more deracinated from its original intentional context. And by the end, you might as well be reading tea leaves. Quite often, it's just a kind of mirror for you to reflect back what you already thought, or what you really fear, or what you really love, and it's not about what the author meant at all. So social media has not helped in that sense, precisely because in order to understand a text properly, we do need to understand what the author meant. And social media obscures the author's intentions. It interferes with our own ability to read purpose into the action.
Do you think anonymity, so there is a lot of anonymity online. There's a little bit of anonymity in the history of fiction. There are works of fiction, works of poetry where very little or maybe nothing is known about the author. I don't know if you remember that book, Primary Colours. Do you remember that novel about Bill Clinton?
Yeah.
And it was published by Anonymous, and there was a kind of frenzy about who it was. And then it was revealed it was this guy, Joe Klein, and everyone, oh God, it was just him. Like it's just that guy. We all know him. We thought
Elena
it was
Ferrante
this.
As well.
And then people sort of a bit lost interest in it. It's actually quite a good book.
It's exciting, isn't it?
But the anonymity gives you permission to so not to give up on intentionality, but to kind of construct your own author,
Yeah, I think we're doing that. Again, it's nothing about fiction that makes that true. It's kind of a version of what we're doing all the time, like when we listen to the radio. So in the sort of closest possible communicative encounter is face-to-face with a human being with sort of infinite time to ask them what they meant, and you can get a chance to say, no, sorry, I put that wrong. I'll say that again. Or you say, did you mean this? Because I think you might have meant that. No, I didn't. And then you that's the perfect encounter. But most encounters are not like that. Whether it's just listening to someone on the radio, or reading what they wrote, or reading it on Twitter, or talking on the telephone where you can't see their face and their gestures, or talking in an environment where it's just not appropriate to say, could you go back a bit? I didn't understand that. So we're always, to some extent, projecting in assumptions. A bit like our visual field is filling in lots of stuff automatically without actually seeing it, because it's just more efficient. The less information we get about someone, or just a sort of string of words put together, the more assumptions we will have to make. We should probably at that point just kind of hold back on the assumptions, but obviously lots of people don't. They just think, you must be a ... So I think this is normal. It's not weird or pathological. It's just that at the moment we are engaging quite often with text where we've got practically no information about the person, not even their age, which I actually think is one of the things we should know most about, because I'm sure there are people, grown professional adults who probably spend most of their lives arguing with 10-year-olds on the internet, and they don't know it.
Or robots.
Or robots, exactly. I mean, they come away with a great sense of satisfaction that they really showed that 8-year-old.
So I'm not going to ask you I might ask you what your projected novel is about.
Campus satire.
Campus satire. So I've not written fiction, and the reason I don't think I ever would is that I think my problem would be the intention would be sort of so heavy-handedly everywhere. Like, great novelists are so brilliant at simultaneously intending something and concealing the intention.
And academics are much...
Yeah, exactly. I just feel like I would... And bad fiction is really bad because the author is everywhere in it.
A bit like Iris Murdoch. I don't know if you've read any of her novels. I mean, they're just so... I did enjoy them, but...
I did too, actually.
But she is not a natural novelist.
Because you can see what she's about.
You can see what she's doing, and it's very abstract and serious.
And there's a moral, in a way.
Yes, exactly. Yes, it's very flat-footed. Yeah, I feared that about my own writing. It's still possibly true. Certainly, if I'd gone straight from academic writing into novel writing...
Into your campus satire.
Yeah, I wouldn't be very good at it. But luckily, I've got this sort of decompression phase where I'm getting to do other kinds of writing where you don't have to spell everything out and you can just leave something hanging. And my editor often just takes out chunks of explanation. Whereas in academia, you'd be it would be demanded by referees, to the point where you think, I've spent 4 pages explaining this perfectly obvious point.
I always think the difference between academic writing and non-academic writing is peer review, and the effect of peer review is nothing ever got shorter after peer review.
No, or better. Well, that's not true. That's a very bold claim.
But let's agree, at least shorter, because inevitably some of the comments are this is missing or that's missing. Yet the experience of being edited in a non-academic setting is the assumption is shorter is almost always better, certainly with journalism, but also with other kinds of publishing, including book-length publishing. And it's a completely different experience, these two kinds of
Well, you can
editing.
be laconic. And the other thing, which is sort of takes us back to the defense of intentionalism and defending it from sort of crass objections, is that it's perfectly possible for an author to kind of leave a question open without having a settled view on what happens next or what this means. And then the reader can speculate profitably about what it might have meant, or, there's lots and lots of endings in fiction where you don't know whether at the end of Villette there's a storm, you don't know whether the protagonist survives or not. At the end of David Copperfield, you're not sure what happens. There's lots of open futures, and in all kinds of writing you can just leave things hanging. And that's compatible with intentionalism too, because you're meant to.
We really hope you've been enjoying this series about bad ideas, and if you would like to support the podcast and help us to keep going and keep growing, just go to ppfideas.com and you can sign up to PPF Plus. You will also get 2 bonus episodes on the history of bad ideas, and those are coming very soon. In the last episode in the main series, I'm going to be talking once again to the writer Helen Lewis, this time about a slightly obscure idea that turns out to have all sorts of interesting and weird ramifications. Next time, Helen Lewis on Mesmerism. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.